Hey guys, welcome back to another video. Today we're going to be taking a look at Airfix's newly released 1/48 scale Westland Seeking HC.4. I have fond memories from when I last built this kit, so let's see what's changed. Hope you enjoy. So we're going to be starting on the interior. Airfix supplies you with a full interior for the HC.4, so naturally you're going to expect to spend a little bit of time in this area. Initially, I'm going around and just starting to put together all of the sub-assemblies which can be left off and painted together. Here on screen you can see me putting together this side section which goes behind the cockpit, which features a brilliant amount of detail, even featuring the tube where pilots can relieve themselves. Now moving on to building up one of the two seats located in the cockpit. These are another engaging bit of building, with your main seat section being encapsulated by three pieces of framework, giving you a nice amount of detail but also a nice sturdy structure. Now I can put together the main instrument cluster which sits in between the two pilots. Now in my opinion this is where the tooling really shows its quality. You can see how lovely and crisp all of those moulded details are. Now the forward facing instrument panel can be cemented into the anti-glare shield, and once again a lovely display of good detailing. This can then be cemented onto the previously assembled control cluster, and that pretty much sums up that. Now it's time to put together the abundance of seats located in the HC.4. Over a year ago now, I made the HU5 version of this kit when it first came out. I must say I prefer the interior in that just because you had a little bit more going on. The HC4 is purely for cargo and transporting people, I believe, so that's why they only have seats instead of having cool sort of radar and sonar devices. That being said, the seats are very nicely detailed. The only critique I would have is the ejection pins on the back. There's quite a lot of them, and a few of them are visible through the windows. So if you are doing this build and you don't want to see ejector pins on the back of your seats, maybe try and fill them in. Now with all of the sub-assemblies put together, everything can receive a generous coating of Mr. Surfacer 1500 Black. After that we can start to get some paint onto this model. The first colour which I'm going to be using is Mr. Colour's C128, which is a grey green. After looking at some reference images I found that this was most suited to the interior colour. What I'm doing on screen is using my airbrush, turning down the PSI, using a little bit of rapid thinner and mottling in between the rivet and panel lines. What this does is introduce some tonal variation and shading in between the panel lines once everything is blended in. Once this process has been applied to all necessary sub-assemblies, what I can do is remix Mr. Colour's C128 with a couple of drops of white into the mix to create a lightened version, and then using this colour I can go along the floor and sub-assemblies highlighting any features which I want to be pronounced. This just introduces more variation and just makes everything look a little bit more worn. Once that has been performed, I can get out my brush and start to pick out all of those finer details. Now then, once all of the details have been picked out, we can start to bring everything together. So firstly, the wall section in between the cockpit and the main cabin can be cemented in, then followed by that corner piece I was talking about earlier. Now all of the flight control, seats and other gubbins can be cemented into that front section of the cockpit. They all drop into these recessed regions, which I really like. It makes glue application much easier. Although I am building this kit out of the box, if you are going to be building this kit, I highly recommend a couple of things. Firstly, either purchasing some resin pilot figures to make those seats look a little bit less bland and make the cockpit feel a little bit more lived in, or just get some seat belts itself, because those seats really are a letdown. They are so plain and you really see a lot of them because of the amount of glass in the cockpit. Now, moving into the cabin, there's not a huge amount to do here except for cementing in the huge amount of seats. They all cement into pre-drilled holes which you drill out at the beginning of the build. Now, after this bulkhead has been cemented into position, the entire of the interior can receive a generous coating of VMS's matte varnish. After this, into the front of the cockpit, it was looking a little bit bland as it was, just being black. So what I'm going to do is dry brush on some buff oil brusher to highlight a couple of the lovely rivets and other details. Here was the final result, and I think that looks much better. So the final piece to be cemented in is the instrument panel. This has been detailed up using the supplied decals in the kit, and I must say they are beautifully printed, very crisp, and make the instrument panel look brilliant. This can be cemented into the front of the cockpit, just sliding into position. Now, two sidewalls and a kind of ceiling piece can be cemented into position to encapsulate all of that hard work in the interior. Be careful here, as there is quite a lot of play in these parts, so do a lot of dry fitting and make sure you're confident with the fitment before you commit to glue. So back onto some sub-assemblies. Here I am putting together the exhaust. I must say this is quite a complex sub-assembly in terms of angles and fitment. However, if you get everything correct and you spend a little bit of time, it builds up rather quickly. Once the assembly is all built up, it can be placed on top of the capsule. Notice how I said placed. Don't use any cement at this stage, purely because when you cement the outer shell of the actual fuselage, whatever those pieces are, into position, you need to make sure that you wiggle the exhaust so that it pokes out in the right direction. Cementing it at this stage could cause some issues down the line. Now, what I'm doing on screen is just populating the exterior fuselage. What I mean by this is just putting in the blanking plates and all the other little bits and bobs which is required for the HC.4 variant. After this is done, the interior capsule can be cemented into one side of the fuselage. Once I'm happy with the fitment, I can bring the other side of the fuselage together and meet them in the middle. A really positive fitment here, no real gaps or issues, just a couple of seams which are very easy to sort out. Now turning the King over, initially this structural piece gets cemented into a raised recess on the underside, and then what I can do is start to build up the underside itself, initially focusing on the nose section where the landing lights are cemented in. Once built up, this underside portion slots into position, once again with a very good fitment. It's a similar story for the rotor section on the top half of the Sea King. This piece, which you can see on screen, does require a little bit of bending and persuasion to get into position. Be careful, make sure you don't split the entire Sea King in half, but you can get it in there eventually. Now this grated front section slots into position as well. Now, this was an area of the kit which I personally struggled with, and I'm not too sure if it was user error or this is just a flawed part of the kit. So initially it starts off rather well with these intake fans slotting into this main sort of jig piece, and then it drops in just above the cockpit, and the next piece to go on is where the problems arise. It is this almost side cover piece, and what I found is that there was probably a 2 to 3 mil gap the entire way around. This was solved quite quickly using some Vallejo plastic putty, which is water-based acrylic so it can be wiped off. I found it for also this top portion of the cover, you can see it's a little bit of a janky fit. It was so questionable that I even retried fitting it to see if it was any different, but the same problem arose. It was just a little bit iffy. But look, it isn't a make or break part of the kit, it's just an area which I definitely think the modeler needs to pay attention to, and it's an area which could require a little bit of extra work. Please let me know if you have made the Sea King or are planning on making this one, if you had the same problem, because then hopefully we'll find out if it was just me with the user error or if this is an actual flaw in the kit. Now moving back on to building up the rest of the Sea King, the front section or front nose portion goes on, and do make sure that you're keeping an eye on any additional extras which might have to be added onto your nose, as each scheme in the kit is a little bit different. Now onto the tail rotor assembly. This is another piece of the kit which is very well thought out and a lot of fun to put together. Airfix states in the instructions that this piece here should not be glued. I personally found in my previous Sea King, when I didn't glue this piece, that the tail rotor, the actual rotor blade, had a little bit of wiggle in it. So for this time, I made sure to cement it and sacrificed having any movability on my model. Now, one of the final things to do before we move on to paint is mask off the canopy. This was just done using Tamiya masking tape and a lot of patience. A thing with the HC.4 which I found was having a tinted upper windscreen. To do this, I'm just going to be using Tamiya's X25 Clear Green. I remember that I thinned this down an awful lot, about 80%, to ensure that I kept a really nice glossy finish. Once that had dried, the rest of the glass can be cemented on. If you'd watched my previous Sea King video, you might remember that I made a mistake, and that was cementing this top half of the canopy on at this stage of the build. Naturally, some varnish got in the last time I did this and fogs up all of the canopy. So this time I just used some PVA glue to kind of tack it in place for the duration of painting. Now then, one of the main differences between this release of the Sea King and the HU5, which was the first release, is the side canards. The HU5 have the kind of big teardrop looking flotation side pods, whereas this one does not, instead having, I believe, one which can be jettisoned out. If anyone is a Sea King expert, do let me know. I personally prefer how the teardrop ones look, as I feel the HC.4 looks almost a little bit naked without them. Now with everything masked off, the Sea King was ready for paint, initially receiving a generous coating of Mr. Finishing Surfaces 1500 Black. This gave me a nice smooth base for all of the painting to be done on top. So then, the scheme which I was going to be going for is scheme A in the kit, which is King of the Junglies, and this is a fully olive drab Sea King. So I selected a darker olive drab, which is Mr. Color's C518, which is actually a Japanese olive drab, but it suited the job. The first thing I'm going to be doing is black basing this colour onto the fuselage by turning down the PSI, taking the crown off of my airbrush and thinning it to an extensive amount. The paint can become very easy to work with and also give you an incredible amount of control if you're using the right brush. When I'm personally using the Mr. Hobby Pro Convoy, I feel completely in control with my painting. So what I've done is highlighted the inner of all of these rivet lines and panels, and then very gently going to blend everything in. What this does is give me a nice tonal variation between the inner of panels and also along the rivet lines. This naturally draws your eyes to all of these lovely details, and it also kind of gives this stressed skin effect, which is evident on the Sea-King, as you can see from this photo. Once I have that initial shading all sorted out, what I'm going to do is add a few drops of Sky Type S into the mixture. I'm not going to use white, as white produces quite a cold tone of the olive drab. Using Sky, which is slightly warmer and already has that greeny tint, gives a far more saturated version of the paint. Using this paint, I'm going to use masking tape and also freehand and create some highlights off of panel lines and in actual panels as well. This just breaks up the very monotone effect that is already present. So here was the result after just doing highlights and that black basing. It looked really good, but I think it could go one step further. So what I did is remixed Mr. Colour C.518, which is the original olive drab, but now put in a few drops of zinc chromate. With this slightly different tone of olive drab, I'm going to re-go in between all of these panel lines and create an even harsher contrast. From now experience of doing these sort of painting effects for a few months, I have found that you really lose the intensity as you start to put varnish and weathering on top. So I wanted to make it look almost too much in the hopes that when it gets toned down, it's right where I want it. So just going through all of these panels, once again highlighting them, really makes them bloom and pops all of that detail out to you. Now then, the final painting effect which I wanted to do on this model was just going to be some very natural darker post shading. What I've done here is got the Mr. Colour C.518 olive drab and added 3 drops of black into it. This just gives me a darkened version, and I'm going over all of the panel lines. Although there aren't really a huge amount of panel lines on this kit, it's more like steps in between panels. So then here was the final effect. I was very happy with how this paint job came out. I thought it was incredibly natural looking and really gave the effect which I was looking for. And this was really only possible because I was in control of my brush, and that is the Mr. Hobby Pro Convoy. My Pro Convoy was supplied to me by Hannants London. Hannants London is my local model shop, and it is where I get all of my kits and supplies. It is stacked with all you could ever dream of in terms of modelling. In top of this, it is right next to the RAF museum, so why not make a day of it? Lastly, if you are interested in the Pro Convoy and would like to purchase it, contact Hannants London, and with your purchase, I will give you some of my time at the back of the shop, helping you get set up and started with it. Whilst I was going on about the brilliant Hannants, I was painting all of the certain aspects which need to be black on the Sea-King. This was done exactly how I painted the olive drab, with the pre and the post shading. It gave me quite a nice sort of faded out looking black, which I was quite happy about. After demasking everything, and I was happy with how everything looked, the airframe received a generous coating of GX100 gloss varnish. Then the decals could be applied. The decals were obviously painted by Cartograph, and they react really well with Mr. Mark Softer and Setter, which you can see me using on screen. And here's what it looked like when all of the decals had been applied. Not the most interesting scheme, but hey, it's iconic and it looks pretty cool. Now onto weathering. I thought I would use this flory wash like I used on the F-35 build, as I had quite good results. You kind of just slop it on, wait for it to dry, and then wipe it off. It's a little bit of a daunting process. I really like the effect which it gives. It's a really nice colour and it really does make them look nice and grotty. However, I found it was quite hard to get some areas to wipe off. And you can see there's a kind of like smudge at the bottom of the Sea King, and that's where I unfortunately rubbed a little bit too hard and burnt through the GX100. It left me a little bit disappointed, so I think in the future I might resort back to my old techniques of just using an Ammo MIG pin wash. Now, using a black oil brusher, I'm going to go around the aircraft highlighting certain panel lines. I used this effect in my recent build with the F-18s and I was very happy with the result, so I thought I'd give it another try here. It's very easy. All you do is streak on some oil in the directed place and then very gently blend it into the surroundings. It gives some more intense shading along the panel lines and just makes everything look a little bit more grotty and grimy. Now, some weathering for the rotor blades. What I'm going to be doing is using a dust oil brusher and originally streaking it in the direction of airflow across the blade. Then what I'm going to be doing is getting a flat-headed brush doused in some white spirit and streaking it more and more. As you can see, if you continue to work that oil throughout the blade, it gives quite a convincing effect of this kind of dusty, worn-in rotor blade, which I was quite happy with. So the final bit of weathering is going to be doing the exhaust stains. This is done really simply using flat black, heavily thinned. What I'm doing is getting the general shape and then very slowly starting to build it up as it streaks along the aircraft. So then, here was the final result after weathering. I really like how everything came up, specifically those exhaust stains. I think they look much better than my first attempt on the previous Sea King. The only gripe I do have is somehow a little bit of silvering appeared on some of the rear decals. But hey ho, you win some, you lose some. It's all part of modelling. So here I am building up the winch. It builds up very nicely with a really fragile framework at the back, which looks right in scale. Now onto my favourite sub-assembly of the entire build, and that is the folded rotor blade. Do keep in mind that there is of course an unfolded version of the rotor blade, but if you have any sort of potential strain on storage, I would recommend doing it folded, as the rotor span on this thing is huge. But anyway, the sub-assembly for this is so enjoyable to put together. Everything slots together really well, there's a brilliant amount of detail, and I just think it's a really cool shape. My only tip for you would be to make sure you have some tweezers at the hand, because there's some small pieces which have to get into some rather awkward areas. So have them on hand and you'll really enjoy the sub-assembly. And there you go, that's it all built up. For an out-of-the-box rotor assembly, I think it is incredibly impressive. Now having a look at the tail rotor, here you can see me putting on the 6-bladed blade, I guess, and then this other piece slots over the top of that. Very technical language, I know. As I wanted everything to be folded up, I also have to cement in the kind of folded section of it, which gives you the correct geometry. Now moving on to the side canards, there is no glue being applied on the actual canard itself. Instead, the glue is applied on the strut, and that is because the strut dictates the actual angle of the canard. So I'd recommend putting the glue on the strut and not on the actual canard, otherwise you might have some wonky landing gear, which no one wants. The tail wheel gets pushed and cemented into place using CA glue here. While still using CA glue, I'm going to be cementing in the ridiculous amount of antennas present on the HC.4. They're all over this thing. Once I'd allowed the CA glue to dry, I also attached the rigging onto the aerial wires. Now the tail rotor assembly can be slotted into position, once again using CA glue. After giving the entire airframe a final unifying coat of VMS's satin varnish, that main windscreen can be removed and can be de-dusted just using a very fine microfiber cloth. The masking tape can then be removed to show that my homemade masking job didn't actually do that badly. After cleaning everything up, it can be cemented back on for its final position. Now this box unit goes on top of the canopy. I believe this is for de-icing, but please let me know if this is wrong. Now the side mounted mirrors can be cemented on as well. This is using ultra glue, which is once again that PVA. Any excess is wiped up using some water. So then onto the final bit now, it's going to be attaching the rotors onto the folded rotor hub, and then it can be placed on top. So thank you very, very much for watching this video. I really do hope that you've enjoyed. If you did enjoy and you'd like to see more content from myself, please make sure to like and subscribe. It really does help. Anyway, without any further ado, enjoy the final photos and videos, and I'll see you next time, guys. Bye bye.